Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Courtney Weatherby. Courtney is Deputy Director of the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program. In this episode, we will discuss the growing crisis of scam centers in Southeast Asia, China's role in these networks, and the implications and challenges for addressing them. Courtney, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to start with a teaser question. As you've been looking and analyzing scam centers in Southeast Asia, particularly in the past year, what have you found most interesting or surprising?
Honestly, I think the thing that surprised me the most is how rapidly we've seen this scam operations evolving. Obviously, internet scams are not new. Many listening and myself are all old enough to remember kind of the Nigerian prince email scams back even in the 90s. We've seen a massive evolution over the last 30 years of what scams look like, but scam compounds themselves have really only been around as a business model, if you will, for something like 6 years. And we've already seen rapid transition in sort of not just where they're located, the style of operations, and the development of this whole ecosystem of criminal actors and technical actors designing suites of tools and apps in this space that make it a much more accessible business model to scam people. And sort of the rapidity of how quickly things have evolved has taken me by surprise.
What specifically happened in the last year that surprised you in terms of the evolution?
Well, I think in terms of evolution, certainly artificial intelligence is now being very widely integrated into online scams. That was probably not unpredictable. I think a lot of the sort of anticipation was that it would be for things like deepfake videos and the other generative AI content. And that certainly is happening. But the thing that surprised me as an outside observer is sort of how it's also been integrated for a lot of efficiency gains in terms of scale of operations and managerial aspects. And that's something that I was not expecting necessarily to see given the hype around AI, for instance, so that they no longer need to have someone who's fluent in English trafficked into a compound to run the scam. They can use multiple AI models to do real-time translation on things and communicate with people in all sorts of different languages. So it is potentially sort of shifting who they're bringing in to work in the scam compounds. And you also see things like chatbots that can help with personas for some of these longer running scams they're trying to run in the pig butchering space, where they need to be keeping track of a lot of different details for different people that they're scamming. So it's evolved somewhat quickly and sort of expanded somewhat quickly, where you're seeing all of these tools designed for scammers and being sort of marketed to scammers through existing channels on Telegram and other places where these groups congregate and share and sell tools and services to one another. So that's been kind of a rapid evolution. Again, it's not really a surprise given the state of the technology. We see similar efforts inside a lot of normal enterprises to improve efficiency gains, but the rapidity with which it's been picked up by scammers has been somewhat surprising.
Great, thank you. I'd like to move from that to really looking at what's been happening. So we've seen some statistics showing that Americans have lost at least $10 billion in Southeast Asia-based scams in 2024, with many projecting that the losses were significantly higher in 2025. So what are these scam centers in Southeast Asia? Where are they located? How do they operate? And how are they targeting Americans?
Yeah, so internet scams aren't new, but this particular business model of internet scams through scam centers is somewhat new. So scam centers, or scam compounds, as they're often called, basically bring together large physical infrastructure investments in some locations. You're building giant industrial scale compounds, in some cases kind of mini cities, to house, feed, and employ a concentrated workforce of tens of thousands of people who are all involved in scamming at various aspects of the scamming process. And employee is kind of a loaded word here because there's very clear evidence that a pretty significant proportion of workers in the scam centers are not there voluntarily. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC, has estimated that more than 300,000 people were trafficked into scam compounds just in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. So while there are many workers who are there voluntarily, Others were lured in and they were basically scammed themselves by false job advertisements for doing normal work in communications or management or technical fields, or which require specific language skills. And then once they arrive in the region, they are in many cases picked up at the airport, brought to the compound, their passports are taken away, and they're forced to work as online scammers, often suffering really inhumane working conditions. So this particular model of operating scams over the internet really only emerged in sort of 2020 in this current form. And it's kind of a new convergence of digital crime, which has historically been done by much more loosely organized groups, often in very different localities. So they're operating via the internet entirely. This is sort of a modality that shifts that into and links it up with a more traditional criminal enterprise model. So you're seeing intersections between digital crime, online scams, and fraud with large-scale physical operations of human trafficking. Some of these are same groups that do drug trafficking, money laundering, and other traditional forms of illicit activities. So that's kind of what the distinct aspect is for scam centers in Southeast Asia. And they are concentrated largely in zones in Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, particularly areas that are relatively undergoverned. So areas like special economic zones where there's extra layers of bureaucracy and a lot of leeway given to local authorities to operate differently than in other parts of the country. In many cases, they're in remote areas along the border and away from central authority and easy observation by outside stakeholders, but they can actually be anywhere. And some of that evolution that I was talking about earlier is sort of this business model rapidly evolving, is that in addition to kind of these big industrial scale buildings and sets of buildings, you also have smaller groups starting to operate in kind of a remote workforce area where people might be working out of a hotel or out of just one office in a business district. So there's a lot of flexibility with that. And it also means that they're not specifically just in these zones, although we see a lot of them in concentrated areas where the infrastructure allows for bringing in everything that you need to run a scam compound, like electricity, good internet access, the mobile workforce, and other things like that. But they're further afield too. They've been found in the Philippines. There was a raid in Dubai earlier this year. There have been numerous instances in Africa, even in Latin and Central America, and even the Isle of Man in the UK, where there were these smaller localized scam compounds being run. So it's not geographically limited.
And Courtney, just to clarify, the major difference or characteristic of the current scam centers in Southeast Asia is the scale and the fact that they're in these physical compounds. Is that what separates them from sort of the prior models, scam models?
Yeah, it's that combined with kind of the trafficking of the workforce that was a really new angle to this and has historically been somewhat unique for Southeast Asia. I think you've seen numerous iterations of online scams, even those run by organized groups, pop up over the last 30 years. Early on, a lot of them were run out of Europe by traditional crime groups. We've seen IT scams where run out of South Asia. Like there are various iterations of scams, and a lot of them did require some organization. What set the Southeast Asia scam centers aside is that they really rapidly evolved into sort of this conjoined digital enterprise tied with large-scale physical infrastructure and then a trafficked workforce to run the scamming efforts.
And we've seen quite a bit of reporting that Chinese actors have been involved in running these scam centers. Can you comment on how prevalent it is for Chinese actors or criminal elements to be involved in the scam centers, particularly in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos?
Yeah, I mean, the way that current scam centers operate evolved in part because of who is running organized crime in the regions that they evolved prior. So when you're looking at the scam compounds, particularly in Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, a lot of the organized crime groups that ran those scam compounds used to do other types of illicit criminal activity. So many of them in particular used to run online gambling or casinos. And others were already involved in things like people trafficking or drug trafficking or wildlife trafficking. So the online scam, sort of the most hyped up or stereotypical online scam that you hear a lot about is called pig butchering. That term itself originated in Chinese, 下酒盘, and it started primarily because they were targeting Chinese citizens. So the first documented cases were really in the late 2010s. Almost all of them were just run inside of China or targeting Chinese citizens. As there was increasing attention to this issue and damage and impact, some crackdowns on groups operating those inside China pushed them to move abroad, just as we'd seen previously with online gambling. In a lot of cases, they kind of co-located or were run by the same organizations. So it started originally as a crime that was perpetrated by Chinese transnational organizations against Chinese citizens. What we saw is, especially during the COVID pandemic, that operations expanded significantly and then went global in nature. So China began cracking down in significant ways on the international operations in 2023. There were joint raids in some of the countries hosting scam compounds. There's a push to have Chinese national criminals extradited back to China. And there was a particularly selective aspect to this because they weren't going after any transnational groups that were doing scamming. It was specifically the ones that they could trace to scamming Chinese citizens. And so this kind of coincided with expansion of efforts that were already ongoing by some of these criminal groups to kind of diversify their target base, if you will, by going after international citizens. But it pushed them to do so more quickly because there was, at that point, much less international attention from law enforcement on this issue from other countries. So there was kind of a shift of targets in response to a higher perceived risk for scamming Chinese citizens as a result of China's activities. But it also coincided with just general awareness and more easy accessibility to technical tools that make it easier to scam international citizens, because in order to really run a good scam, you need to be able to communicate with the victim, particularly for some of these longer running and more damaging scams like the pig butchering scams, where you have to build a relationship with the target so that they trust you and will send you money or continuously invest in whatever investment opportunity you are highlighting. And Americans in particular, but also others from sort of developed countries where there's just higher wealth, and that they become a much more popular target because it's perceived as lower risk in the face of Chinese law enforcement, but also perceived as potentially higher reward because you might be able to scam a lot more money out of an American than you would if you were trying to scam the average citizen in a country where the income is lower, for instance, Thailand or Vietnam. Scams are happening globally. All of these countries are being targeted, but the income generated is going to be higher on countries where there's more wealth available.
On that point, do you have a sense of how much income is generated per country or per region? I think I mentioned earlier, or at least what we saw was that based on public reporting, Americans have lost somewhere around 10 billion or so in 2024. Do you have a sense of what that figure is now, and how much of the targeting is focused on America compared to other countries?
So honestly, it's a great question, and it's a difficult question to answer in part because this particular set of crimes is very underreported. So, you'd highlighted the statistic, which I think came from the recent FBI internet crimes report that was highlighting at least $10 billion was lost in 2024. I think it was increasing in 2025. That's just the reported losses. The FTC has previously estimated that only 10% or perhaps less of funds lost to scams are actually reported due to various reasons, right? Like sometimes there's shame involved. People are ashamed to admit that they've been scammed because it's often socially treated as a personal failure. There's also uncertainty in who to report to, right? Should you report to the government? Should you report to the platform where the person who scammed you contacted you, like Facebook, if it was Facebook Marketplace or WhatsApp? Do you report to your financial institution? Do you report to your telecoms company if the outreach was done through phone calls or text? So there's kind of uncertainty about the best way to report these scams. There's uncertainty about what is going to be done if you report these scams. And in some cases, victims of scams have reported that the local police won't even take their report because it's not viewed as sort of a local crime. It's not viewed as within their purview. So for various reasons, we don't have a good handle on exactly how much is lost every year. But if you think of that as like a 10% estimate, right, in 2024, then that was likely at least $100 billion that were actually lost. It's also difficult to really break through the where the money is flowing to. It's often going through very complicated processes used in money laundering. So it's jumping multiple accounts. It's often brought in through cryptocurrency. So it's difficult to get a good pinpoint handle on exactly how much is going into each of these Southeast Asian countries. There was some good analysis done a couple years ago by the U.S. Institute of Peace that estimated, I think, something like $40 billion in just 1 year was brought into these three countries. And so when you compare that against the GDP of these countries, you can get an estimate of how much impact that has. Obviously, not all of these funds are staying local because these groups are operating in these countries, but the largest portions of the wealth are kind of being passed up the management chain to the elites who are running them, not necessarily staying in the local economy of the places where scam centers are operating. But the losses are significant.
Courtney, do you have a sense of what proportion of the U.S. population is impacted? And do these scam centers target a particular segment of the population, or because they're more AI enabled, it can really target all segments of the U.S. population?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think anybody and everybody is a likely scam victim and a likely scam target. There's a lot of public attention, understandably, given to particularly vulnerable populations like the elderly, especially because so much wealth tends to be concentrated in their hands because of retirement funds. But really, it's anybody and everybody. Generally speaking, the average American encounters something like 377 scam outreach attempts a year. So it's more than one attempt daily. That's obviously extremely widespread. It is a challenge to manage because it's just a huge scale of what's being lost and what's being affected when you're dealing with sort of this big data challenge of having to deal with multiple attempts every day for most Americans. That means that something like 80% of Americans have encountered a scam, and then something like 20% or 40%, even depending on which study you reference, have actually engaged with a scammer. So that doesn't necessarily mean every one of those people has lost money. It's a smaller percentage, but many of those people who see those scam texts, those scam emails, those scam outreaches through social media, they might click on a link. They might do a first response before they realize that something is fishy and stop engaging with the scammer.
But we've seen a lot of focus from the Trump administration on these scam centers in Southeast Asia and in some cases also from Dubai, and the linking of them to Chinese actors, including Chinese criminal organizations. So to what extent, in terms of the scams that the average American may come across or be scammed by, how much of that is actually attributed to Chinese-linked actors or organizations from your perspective?
So I wish I had a good statistic to give you on that. Unfortunately, I don't because there's not enough information available about attribution. But I can say, for instance, there are a few specific hallmarks for types of scams that tend to be associated with groups based in Southeast Asia and thus Chinese criminals versus, for instance, scam rings that are being run out of countries in Africa or South Asia or other places, which are also scam hubs. So particularly the cryptocurrency investment scams, and a lot of the online romance scams, many of those seem to be associated with groups based in Southeast Asia. The crypto investment scams in particular fall into sort of that pig butchering model, are very clearly linked to Southeast Asia. So that's where you'll see the clearest link for Chinese crime organizations stealing funds from Americans. And, we can sort of see this sort of double-digit rise in that particular scam model over the last few years. If you look back to FBI statistics on reports for scams, you see every year there's sort of differences and transitions in which scams are the most common. But that particular type of investment scams tends to be associated with the highest losses and the highest damages.
So, Courtney, can you share a little bit why are Chinese criminal networks focusing on cryptocurrency and online romance? What makes these two categories appealing and draws the Chinese criminal networks into trying to scam Americans or other countries?
Yeah, so I think the key for cryptocurrency investment scams in particular is that there's a very high rate of return on those. When someone is being scammed into what they think is an investment opportunity, they're going to make more money available than when they think that they're, for instance, they're falling for a scam that is a government impersonation scam or something else where it's like more tied to something short term like paying a fine. With these cryptocurrency investment scams and also romance or other confidence schemes where you have to build a relationship with the target, you get a lot more buy-in. You convince the person you've got a real relationship with them, and so they're more willing to put more money on the line. So when you look at sort of the reported losses, at least in the United States, within sort of the FBI complaints data, the investment scams are not necessarily the most prolific in terms of the number of reported scams, but they are by far the highest in terms of losses to scams. So there is a financial motive to hone in on scams that will bring sort of a high reward for the scammers. But just to be clear, like they are also engaging in a variety of other types of scams. So when you're looking at these scam compounds that I was talking about in Southeast Asia, what you're really looking at is a number of different smaller organizations that are co-locating because there's benefits to co-locating. But you might have one group that's running a crypto investment scam. You might have one that's running a romance scam. You might have some that are running government impersonation scams. They're all in the same compound. They're each pursuing their own interests, but they're taking advantage of sort of shared infrastructure and in many cases shared relationships with local authorities to look the other way to ensure that your operations can continue unaffected. So there's a whole plethora of different types of scams out there.
I'd like to now transition to talk a little bit more about how the United States is responding and what you view as effective or not effective. So we've seen reports that, for example, the U.S. sanctioned the Prince Group, which is a major criminal organization running large-scale scam centers across Cambodia. And then its chairman, a Chinese national with reported ties to a Chinese official, was then arrested and extradited to China. So do these types of high-profile actions, do they actually matter if we take out the person at the top? I've also seen other reports that some of these networks, that once you start targeting them in Southeast Asia, you've seen some of these Chinese nationals then go back to China and then start operating from China. How do you see so far in terms of the effectiveness of U.S. actions to target some of these scam centers?
Yeah, I think, when we're talking about the scale of the problem, I think it's really crucial to think about effectiveness. And I do think the US has really just started rolling out a response to the scale of the problem within the last year. So the sanctioning of the Prince Group was a really important, high profile, public and pretty broad effort to take down a particular organization where there's been a lot of investigation in recent years into sort of the specific ties and entities that were involved in criminal activities. And I think, when you're talking about sort of how to dismantle a network, it can't just be going after the people at the top, but going after the leaders and the elites who are ultimately actually the key beneficiaries of the scam activities is quite crucial to increasing the risk for players in this space. So when you're looking specifically at the Prince Group, there's been public reporting for a few years from various investigative journalists and others about the ties to the Prince Group and also the ties to sort of the conglomerate Huiwan, which was involved in a lot of the payment processes that scammers were using and for funding transfers and other activities as well. So there's been a lot of pressure for governments to do something about the scam compounds. But historically, we've seen responses in Cambodia and in Laos and in Myanmar as well, particularly targeting the compounds themselves and the low-level operators. So for instance, there have been, over years after complaints from foreign governments, there have been raids on scam compounds, but they've been very performative in nature where, there are reports that the local authorities warned the operators that they needed to move because there was going to be a raid. And so the truly crucial staff, including the upper management and even middle management in many cases, including equipment and others, they basically just moved people out. So if you had a raid, you're basically raiding the low-level operators. So like I mentioned earlier, trafficking, human trafficking into scam compounds has been an issue. So if you're getting a raid in previous years where it was performative, you might get folks who were trafficked in and didn't actually want to be working in scam compounds. You were getting people who were kind of operating at the sort of lowest level of the hierarchy, but you were not capturing those who were making the actual decisions, who were running the operations. So in that sense, moving beyond a performative raid to a raid system or a prosecution system, which is going after some of the higher level crime bosses like Chen Zhi, is important, and it's really crucial. It's also not necessarily sufficient, even in this particular crackdown that we've seen with Cambodia, where the extradition of Chen Zhi to China, it was one of many arrests of folks that were within the Prince Group and the Huayuan network. That has continued. There were just new sanctions announced again very recently in mid-2026, following sort of the initial sanctions, an announcement that Prince Group was part of a criminal organization in October of 2025. So it's an ongoing effort, and it really does require rooting people out across the entirety of the organization. Because if you don't get the higher level elite and you don't get the mid-level management, you will simply see people shifting location and setting up operations just as they have done in response to sort of performative short-term crackdowns in the past.
And Courtney, just to also link this to what China's been doing on their end, there's also been reported cases of China handing down life sentences as well as severe punishment on Chinese nationals that have been involved in these scam centers. Could you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I think, it's absolutely quite complicated because we as outsiders don't necessarily have full bandwidth or insight into sort of the black box of how these crackdowns and the extraditions and the prosecutions unfold in all cases because there's so many people involved. I think when you're looking at China's response, it's crucial to understand that because China was heavily targeted by these transnational criminal groups early on, there is genuine political will in China to go after scam groups targeting Chinese citizens. And I think that last point is quite important when you're looking at some of these very high profile cases. They're going after criminals that have targeted Chinese citizens to steal money from Chinese citizens, and in some cases traffic Chinese citizens into scam compounds. So it is a very broad effort, but it's also been a very selective effort in that they're not necessarily targeting organizations which do not target Chinese citizens. They're targeting the organizations which are directly impacting their own interests domestically. So, for instance, there isn't necessarily a lot of clarity on when they are doing investigations, and they turn up clear evidence as part of their investigations into impacts on Chinese citizens. And they also turn up evidence about impacts on Australian citizens or American citizens. It's not clear how much of that information, if any, is being shared to help support law enforcement cases in other countries. So, in that sense, China's doing a lot, but it's doing a lot in its specific interests. And this is a major challenge, not just for China, although China's been a very active actor in this space. But it's a broader challenge because if you have countries really only targeting groups that are targeting their own citizens, what we'll end up with is this situation of whack-a-mole where these groups are adaptive, they're flexible, they aren't necessarily permanently invested in the physical infrastructure, they can move. So it really requires kind of a coordinated multi-country effort to respond to this because these criminal groups are very good at exploiting loopholes in information sharing and also in finding ways to get local buy-in or protection in areas that are particularly undergoverned. Like I was talking about specific zones in Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia where they've essentially had enough buy-in that they could operate without severe disruption up until quite recently.
And just to use the case that we were talking about earlier, the case of Chen Zhi, the ringleader of the Prince Group, after he was extradited to China, it's still unclear how China has sentenced him. Or do you have more information on that?
I do not have more information on that. It's possible that the case is still ongoing. I would expect that, because Prince Group was so heavily involved globally that there could be some public response eventually. It's possible there's still a strong case being built. It's also possible that they're not going to publicly highlight what comes out of the prosecution or what the sentence handed down is going to be. It could be treated internally rather than as a public effort.
And then you were talking about some of the I guess, shortfalls in how China might be treating uh, Chinese citizens involved in scam centers abroad, particularly if those Chinese citizens aren't targeting the Chinese population. To what extent, beyond taking national action, do you see China in any way cooperating or helping the U.S. government deal with these scam centers? Or is it more of the United States requesting help from China and then China being willing to extradite its own citizens back to China, and then we're just waiting for some of the processes to wrap up?
I do think that there's a need for more information sharing between China and not just the United States, but other countries that are being targeted by scams that are seeking to do their own prosecutions as well. I think, again, you get into that complexity, though, with many of these criminal organizations involved being Chinese, that you get sovereignty questions. You get questions of, is China going to prosecute them for activities? And if they do they then want to allow that information and that citizen to be reviewed in other countries as well? So there are certainly challenges, but there's also real opportunities given the ongoing nature of some of these crimes for the United States and China to collaborate both directly with one another, but also through broader global efforts. So there was a joint raid earlier this year in Dubai, where the U.S. and China were directly engaged with other countries as well. And I think that type of very targeted effort is probably feasible and in the interest of both countries.
And Courtney, one final question for you. You mentioned the importance of partnerships with third countries. You also mentioned very early in this podcast that there's been a concentration of these scam centers in 3 countries in Southeast Asia, but of course, they are also in other countries too. To what extent is the United States able to work with the governments in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos to tackle these scam centers?
With the governments in Cambodia and Laos, and certainly is doing so to counter the scam compounds, right? I mean, we've seen in response to the sanctions, there has been concerted capacity building efforts and I think some joint efforts and investigation between the U.S. and Cambodia. There have been past discussions with Laos on doing similar work. I think that the challenge ultimately comes down to it ultimately comes down to one of sort of political will in the countries involved. Myanmar is its own special, complicated case because of the ongoing civil conflict and sort of the challenges in the U.S. directly engaging with both the current regime in Myanmar, but also with some of the organizations that are controlling zones where scam compounds are held. Many of them are in groups controlled by ethnic armed organizations. Many of them are groups that the U.S. doesn't necessarily have a formal relationship with. That has been kind of a broad challenge, not just for the U.S., but for other countries in engaging with Myanmar on this issue and other issues as well, given the conflict. But when you're looking at Laos and Cambodia, there are clear indications, especially in Cambodia, that some in the government see this as a major problem for Cambodia, and they're looking for international partnerships. So Cambodia did pass a law earlier this year that was looking at basically increasing the penalties and making it a much clearer crime to do online scamming. So they passed in April a law on anti-technology fraud, which kind of updates the way that their legal system looks at things to allow for prosecution of crime. At the same time, there's general capacity challenges that the U.S. could likely be doing more on, for instance, with assisting victims of trafficking and gaining intelligence from victims of trafficking who are escaped from compounds in Cambodia and in Myanmar, and who are currently kind of stuck because they don't have the resources to get home. They have a lot of operational intelligence into how things work in the scam compounds, and there's a real opportunity for the U.S. and others interested globally in combating these issues to provide assistance to them, but also to then get information on how the scam compounds work that could be used for future investigations and potentially criminal cases. So there's capacity building that could be done. At the same time, I do want to recognize that a lot of these groups were able to operate because they were able to get some form of cover in the localities in which they were operating. And so if that has not gone away, then the other things which have led to this kind of moment where we're seeing more than a performative crackdown in Cambodia, but not necessarily a full crackdown, there's a little bit of uncertainty about where things are going in the future. And there certainly is more that the U.S. could be doing to try and support those crackdown efforts and real responses, but it may also require more resources than the U.S. currently has dedicated to this effort when you think about the scale of the problem. So, I was talking earlier about people being trafficked into scam compounds, and there also being voluntary workers. Some estimates have been that more than 300,000 people have left Cambodia just this year in response to the scam crackdowns. Now, that is not necessarily capturing a lot of the trafficked victims who didn't have the resources to leave and who are now still stuck on the streets, but that indicates the scale of the problem. That's 300,000 people that were likely involved in, illegal activities, some of which there might have been enough evidence to make a case towards, but they left the country freely. That means many of them are likely moving to scam compounds in other localities, whether it's they're moving to Laos or Myanmar or moving farther afield to newer locations where they're operating in a more localized manner in smaller groups because they weren't arrested. So there is sort of this scale challenge that's a lot of people to have to coordinate a law enforcement effort against in another country, and a lot of resources that have to be poured in. But again, these people also have resources of their own because they're organized transnational criminal organizations.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Courtney, for joining me today to unpack the complexities of scam centers that are particularly being operated in Southeast Asia from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and the extent to which Chinese national actors as well as criminal groups are involved, and the complexities in trying to address these scam centers. Thank you, Courtney, very much for joining me for this session.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me. Unfortunately, it's a problem that's not going away, but it's an important one to discuss.